Is about a 30-minute video over the War of 1812, which was under James Madison's administration. If you look on that file under Jeffersonian, I believe, it is towards the end, the last couple of slides, starting with slide 31 and going to slide 39. So, James Madison, never have I seen so much mind in so little matter. He is a political and diplomatic genius. His nickname actually in Congress was Big Knife. They adopted a name the Indians call him because he cut deals. Remember, this is the guy who put together the two great compromises in the Constitution. He's called the father of the Constitution, a great political mind, and a wonderful counterbalance to Thomas Jefferson, who was much more of an idealist, mainly because he was in Paris for 5 years while the country is in chaos under the Articles of Confederation. James Madison is there. He's seeing what's going on, and he's much more practical and pragmatic than Jefferson. And really, between the two of them, they balanced out the Republican Party. John Adams said of Madison and Jefferson, the influence of these two mighty minds upon each other is a phenomenon. So a perfect balance of practicality and idealism. President Madison has a great political mind, a great government mind, but he is dealing with impossible problems. Even Washington would have had problems dealing with the same issues that Madison did. Ironically enough, he is our first war president and probably the least warrior-like president we could ever possibly have. 5'3", 110 pounds, not at all warlike, not at all soldier material. But the War of 1812 is called Mr. Madison's War because it's under his administration. We saw what was going on under Thomas Jefferson. There was no clear solution to it. Both France and England were seizing our ships at sea and impressing our troops. By Madison's administration, we are losing a ship every 2 days. Something like 20-25% of our ships are being seized, primarily by Britain, because she has a bigger navy. We had over 10,000 sailors who were impressed into the British Navy. And Madison finally realizes he has no choice, as he said, between absolute disgrace and resistance by force, because no European power is honoring neutral rights at sea. After the embargo was repealed within a year, it was replaced with the Non-Intercourse Act, which meant no trade with Britain, and you can imagine how well that went over because America depends on sending things to Europe to survive economically. And of course, we don't obey directions, and we smuggled right and left, and it was almost impossible to control the smuggling because we don't have a large military, we don't have a large navy. Okay, we did have, about the same time, a grand total of 5 battleships by the time Madison is president. The British, at the same time, have 1,000 military ships and 120,000 sailors. So this is not exactly an equal war, but there is a land component too because Britain owns Canada as well. So the War of 1812, as you can see on the slide, has 2 nicknames. It's called the Last Battle of the Revolution. I'll get to that. And it's also called the Unnecessary War. And I can tell you right now why it's unnecessary. 2 good reasons. First of all, we declare war on Britain. Congress voted for it. Madison signed off on it. We declare war on Britain after Britain has already changed what they call the Orders in Council. Britain has already agreed to basically lay off. But of course, it takes 2 to 3 months to get across the Atlantic. In the meantime, we have declared war. Britain had already solved a large portion of the problem, but we didn't know. By the time we get the news, blood has been shed, we're already at war. So in one way, it was unnecessary. The other thing that's unnecessary about this war is the great battle of the war, the real conclusive American victory, is fought 3 weeks after the treaty is signed. So totally unnecessary and totally unnecessary loss of life. So if you look on that map, You can see very quickly what's going on in the War of 1812. This is divided into several different parts. First of all, there is a Canadian border with America, and there is war along the Canadian border. We even tried to invade Canada. There weren't many settlers there, but again, you don't invade Canada because it has a nasty winter. We did send a group, and pretty much the winter destroyed the small military force that we sent. We were overconfident. People in Congress said, I believe the Kentucky militia alone are competent to place Canada at your feet. Not really. The other thing immediately that is done is a naval war in the Atlantic. There is some naval activity on the Great Lakes in which America did pretty well because our boats are fairly evenly matched. But on the Atlantic, we have 5 small battleships, and Britain has 1,000 warships, including 100 ships of the line. These are ships with 3 masts, 3 decks, all of which have cannon, sometimes up to 120 cannon per ship. So we are basically outgunned. First thing Britain does, same thing she did in the Revolution, blockade the coast, cut America off. At that point, we're really stuck because we can't get our goods to market and the economy is taking a hit. The main area that we are concerned with is the war, the interior war in America, the war in the West. In the Northwest, above the Ohio Valley, you have conflicts between, of course, the English, who are arming and encouraging the Native Americans and the Native American uprisings, and in the Southwest. You also have the British land on the East Coast after they've blockaded it, and land and attempt to take the American capital. If you can capture a nation's capital, this is a huge coup. Why are they doing this? Because for morale purposes. Also, we had burned previously Toronto, which was the British capital in Canada, which was not a big deal. It was basically 100 wooden houses, but we burned it to the ground. So this is tit for tat. The British are coming in and saying, we are going to destroy your capital. DC was unprepared and largely undefended. Madison did ride out. There were troops there, but not very much, nothing to compare with the British military. They land thousands of troops. They march on Washington, D.C., and every government building in Washington, D.C. was destroyed. This is where Dolly Madison grabs everything in the White House and flees in a wagon right before the British arrive and got the good stuff out. As the British are marching through Washington, D.C., they did not attack civilians or civilian homes, just government buildings. An American on the sidewalk looking up at this large column of British troops sees the British officer and says, if George Washington had been alive, you would not have come to Washington, D.C. and taken it easily. And the British officer turned around and replied to him, if George Washington had been president, we would never have thought of coming. But George Washington is dead, and James Madison is president. So what do we get out of this war? If you scroll down, we get a couple of things. Number one, we get the Star-Spangled Banner. After burning Washington, D.C., the British troops advanced north towards Baltimore, which is just north of Washington, D.C., intending to burn Baltimore as well. They did not because Baltimore was prepared. Baltimore was defended. The British troops did not get into Baltimore. And Francis Scott Key, sitting in a ship in the harbor, looks out the next morning and sees the American flag is flying over the little fortress in Baltimore. So we get a flag. We also get a national anthem written about that flag that nobody can sing because it's full of high notes, but we did get something. If you want to see the actual Star-Spangled Banner, it is in the Smithsonian in a very dark room trying to preserve it today. So it's big. I thought it was a flag. It's not a flag. It's like 100 by 150 feet. This thing is enormous. I have no idea what kind of flagpole they flew it on, but it is a big flag. Anybody could see it in the harbor, not only just Francis Scott Key. The real crucial battle is in the West. Who is in the West? A very tall, young Tennessean named Andrew Jackson, who is tall, skinny, and has red hair, so we know right away he's from Scotch ancestry. What is he doing out there? He has about 1,500 militia, frontiersmen, Kentucky and Tennessee frontiersmen, and he is fighting Indians. He is basically wiping out Indian tribes because the British, of course, were encouraging Native Americans to rise up and slaughter Americans. We're at war with Britain and Canada. He does a very good job. He pretty much wiped out the Creek Nation and a number of other villages. There is a long-term war that starts in Florida that goes on. And the word comes from Washington that we have found out that the British intend to attack New Orleans. If they can take New Orleans, again, looking at the map, if you can take New Orleans, you can control the Mississippi because we have nothing out there anyplace along the Mississippi. The British idea is grab New Orleans, you've paralyzed everything west of the mountains, we can't send anything to market, and if you go up the Mississippi, you can split the West off, you can split the Louisiana Territory off and claim it for Britain. We didn't have settlers, we had pretty much nothing out there. So Andrew Jackson is given direction to take his, actually it was 1,200, Kentucky and Tennessee militia into New Orleans, defend New Orleans because the British are coming. We also had a garrison of about 800 troops in New Orleans, American troops. So together there are about 2,000. The word is that the British are coming with approximately 5,000 well-trained veteran troops from the wars in Europe. Jean Lafitte was a pirate, Laffite. I'm sorry I didn't write his name down on that slide. He is a pirate. What goes on in New Orleans? Same thing that's been going on in New Orleans for a long time. New Orleans has always been a fairly sketchy town. And the going business at the time was, besides trade, piracy. Jean Lafitte, of course, French name, he and his brothers are running a fairly large piracy operation, attacking ships in the Gulf. They have a number of ships. Anybody who sailed in the Gulf was subject either to pay a ransom, pay a bribe to them to be left alone, or their cargo was seized. What do they do with this? They sell it on the streets of New Orleans. They would actually post billboards. Great sale Friday of fine French furniture and French wine. Everybody knew where this stuff came from, but this is New Orleans. And these guys made a very good living basically selling stolen goods. Again, what do pirates do for a living? They seize ships. If you remember Johnny Depp, Pirates of the Caribbean, what is their skill set? How do you seize a ship? You attack it and board it, but first you shoot cannon at it and try and disable it. So what is the skill set of pirates? A lot of them are very good artillerymen. This becomes very useful. So Andrew Jackson shows up at New Orleans. He only has 2,000 men. He openly recruits anybody who will fight for the American cause. And people come. He gets slaves. He gets Cajuns, who are not very fond of the British, who had escaped from Nova Scotia. He has free African Americans. He has immigrants who are landing. He has sailors off ship. And together he puts together about maybe 3,000 men, less than about half the size of the British troops. This is the first multiracial, multi-ethnic American army. It took us until after World War II to integrate the American army, but Andrew Jackson did it in 1814. Some of his key men are the pirates. Why would they help Andrew Jackson? First of all, French ancestry. Jean Lafitte is definitely a French name. There is some story that one of their brothers was in jail in New Orleans, so maybe they made a deal, let him out of jail and we'll help you guys. The British came to Jean Lafitte separately and offered him a lot of money, an estate in England, complete pardons for him and all his crew if they would help the British. Jean Lafitte says, let me think about it. He goes the next day, he offers his services to Andrew Jackson in New Orleans, and Andrew Jackson accepts it. So, looking again at the map, there are two maps of New Orleans. The first one, you can see the problem with New Orleans. If you ever drive from Austin to New Orleans, you know immediately what the problem is. It's in a swamp. It's surrounded by water. All the roads into New Orleans today are raised 10 feet off the ground. which is why it flooded in Katrina. There is only one way the British can come. They're coming up from the Gulf, and if you look at that map, there is only one axis. Lake Pontchartrain is on one side, the Mississippi is on the other side. There is a narrow neck of land that you can approach New Orleans by land. You can also approach a little bit from the north, but it's mainly swamps. So they have to come in from the south. The pirates tell Andrew Jackson, this is where the British have to come. Andrew Jackson knows nothing about New Orleans and swamps. So they build a barricade. You can see it in the last slide. They build a barricade across this neck of land, ending in the Mississippi on one side and the swamps in the other. They build something about man height, about eye level. They use hay bales, they use wagons, they use logs, they use whatever they can come up, cotton bales, and build a chest high or a man-high barricade. In front of the barricade, they actually dig a ditch. And I'd love to say they put alligators in it, but I don't think that was true, but there was water, so maybe alligators were in there. Anyway, so they're prepared. Every so often along this defensive line, they set up a cannon taken from the pirate ships and manned by the pirates, because Kentucky and Tennessee riflemen don't know anything about operating cannon. So the pirates are crucial to the Battle of New Orleans. Did they turn the tide? Maybe, maybe not, but they were definitely crucial. Okay, so this defensive line is only about a mile long. There are 8 artillery batteries manned by the pirates. Americans had been harassing and skirmishing with the British troops. 5,000 British troops line up. And if you're ever in New Orleans, you really need to go to Chalmette Battlefield, which is the Battle of New Orleans. It is right outside of town. I mean, it's a 5-minute drive from downtown New Orleans. And it was absolutely amazing. I'd never been there. This is a tiny battlefield. It's about the size of 2 football fields. You can walk across the whole thing in 10 minutes. But the British, being the British, lined up in their red suits, still wearing red suits, 80 across, in rows of 3 and 4, and they march towards the American barricade. Again, they are massively underestimating the American army, the American defense. They called the American soldiers dirty shirts, which was pretty accurate. Another quote from a British officer, the Americans are a whiny race like spaniels, like dogs, and they need to be disciplined like dogs. So they're massively underestimating. The orders are, don't shoot till you see the whites of their eyes, at about 100 yards, less than 300 feet. The British are coming at the barricade, and Andrew Jackson orders open fire. In 30 minutes, in the first wave of 3,000 British soldiers, 290 dead, 1,300 wounded, 600 captured, including all 81 officers and 3 generals that were in the first wave of troops. Basically, we annihilated the British Army. They walked up to the barricade and we opened fire and completely annihilated them. This is a British officer speaking of this battle afterwards. In less time than I can write it, the regiment vanished from sight. When the smoke cleared, it looked like a sea of blood. It was the red coats of the British soldiers. The field was entirely covered in prostrate bodies, in dead bodies. This is one of the great victories in American history. We annihilated, pretty much either killed, captured, wounded, almost all of the 3,000 British troops in the first wave. American casualties in the entire battle. Different numbers I've read of the number of dead, but at the top, maybe about 40 dead, 13 wounded, compared to 3,000 casualties on the British side. So a huge American victory. The British line up, they do it again with equal casualties. Slow learning curve with the British. So what do we get out of the War of 1812? If you look at that last slide, number 39, the treaty is signed in Ghent, Belgium. It was signed before the battle was fought in New Orleans. So all of these deaths totally unnecessary. But this is a very necessary war for America. It's called the Second Battle for Independence, the Second War for Independence, or the Last Battle of the Revolution, because this is when Britain finally recognizes America as an independent country. One reason they were impressing Americans as British sailors is they never recognized us as a separate country. So if you're on an American ship, you obviously must be a British citizen, and we can draft you. John Adams, a more necessary war was never undertaken. It was necessary against England, necessary to convince France that we were something, and above all, necessary to convince ourselves that we were not nothing. We are no longer 18 different colonies, 18 different states. We are now a nation. And as another American politician said, we are more American. We feel and act now as a nation. So very important for American morale, for America psychologically. Militarily, what did we get out of it? Totally unnecessary. No territory changes hands. Nothing is different after the war. Thank God Napoleon had been fighting Britain in England and in the continent, because if Napoleon hadn't been occupying Britain, she could have thrown all of her military force in the War of 1812 and would have crushed us. But most of her troops were still in Europe. We gained no territory. We did gain some British soldiers who deserted on the spot and joined the American cause. After the War of 1812, Britain becomes, for the rest of American history, Britain is today our strongest ally. She finally got out of the Ohio Valley, where she still had armed some forts. We had some fishery deals in the North Atlantic. A little bit later, we settled the Canadian border, a 3,000-mile border with Canada. It was settled peacefully. This is the longest peaceful border any place in the world, the longest unfortified border in the world. You can cross from Canada into the United States almost anywhere if you want to walk across northern Canada with the mosquitoes in the summer or the snow in the winter. It is largely an unmanned border. Everybody after the war knows the name Andrew Jackson. He's a national hero. Guess who's running for office about 10 years later? Native Americans, they lose everything. They sided, not surprisingly, with the British. They were more afraid of Americans killing them and pushing them out. Britain lost the war. What happens to Jean Lafitte? That he and his men were immediately pardoned by the Americans. Madison pardoned them all. They went and stayed in New Orleans. They lived very well. They had a lot of money from their piracy. And there's two different stories about what happened to Jean Lafitte. The first story is that he moved to Galveston, also a sketchy town, and married an incredibly wealthy widow and died quietly in his sleep. The other story is that he continued in New Orleans but shifted the base of his operations to Galveston, continued piracy, and was lost at sea in some battle with an American ship. Don't know which story is true, but Jean Lafitte disappears from the records. We don't know what happened to him, but the pirates are really a crucial factor in the Battle of New Orleans. Without it, they knew the land, they knew the waters, they had the artillery. We probably would have had a serious time trying to stop the British. But we now not only have New Orleans, there is no question that the western third of the continent is ours as well. So that's the story of the War of 1812. The only battle I'm interested in is in the Battle of New Orleans. Next time I'm moving into economic expansion into the next chapter. Thanks and stay safe.